This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. This is historian Stephen Ujifusa. My concept of time has changed drastically as I've gotten older. I am now 45, and I feel that right now time is speeding up. And maybe that has to do with having children and a sense that my life is probably about halfway through. In my 20s and early 30s, I felt that the time to experiment and to learn and to try new things was almost infinite. And it was also a time that America felt a lot more secure as a country, as a world power. And now it seems we're at a time where things are a lot more uncertain. I almost feel that we're on the brink of a World War I redux. I am hoping that is not the case, judging by world events, but one never knows. And I came across an image a few years ago of a clock that stands on the corner of 43rd Street and Lancaster Avenue in Philadelphia. And it's in front of a jewelry store. The picture was taken on a quiet day. There is very little traffic. In fact, when photographs were taken in those days, passing pedestrians and automobiles often appeared simply as a blur because exposure periods were very long. But this image is dated April 22nd, 1914. And this was a time when America and the world were standing on the brink of a tremendous crisis on the start of World War I. Across the Atlantic Ocean from Philadelphia, people were acting as if nothing was untoward in the state of the world. In fact, the writer George Orwell would write of those few months before the war, in fact, those few years before 1914, as a halcyon period. But he also sensed that there was something unhealthy going on, of a brewing conflict. George Orwell wrote in 1952, several decades after the start of World War I, "From the whole decade before 1914, there seems to breathe forth a smell of the more vulgar, ungrown-up kind of luxury, an atmosphere, as it were, of eating everlasting strawberry ices on green lawns to the tune of the Eton boating song." In the Belmont section of Philadelphia, which is depicted in this photograph, life was a lot less luxurious than George Orwell depicted. This was a middle and working class district full of German and Jewish immigrants who ran small businesses, who worked in factories. And the date on April 22nd, 1914 stands still here in this photograph of an ordinary city scene in the city of Philadelphia. And here is this piece I've written showing this clock at 43rd and Lancaster Avenue on a typical day in 1914, just before the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28th, 1914, causing all of Europe to go to war. And 3 years later, America would be dragged into this conflict. The date is Wednesday, April 22nd, 1914. On that day, George Herman Babe Ruth played his first professional baseball game, pitching for the then minor league Baltimore Orioles, in an exhibition game against the Major League Philadelphia Phillies. To the amazement of the spectators, Babe Ruth proved to be one of those rare pitchers who could also hit. He left the game with a 6-hit, 6-0 win. Incidentally, Baltimore's major league team at the time was the quaintly named Terrapins, the main ingredient in the city's most famous turtle soup. Incidentally, Baltimore's major league team at the time was the quaintly named Terrapins, the main ingredient in the city's famous turtle soup. The Terrapins went the way of the dodo the following year, and the Orioles replaced them as Baltimore's major league baseball team. The residents of the Philadelphia neighborhood of Belmont, like so many other Americans, were bewitched by baseball. However, sports radio broadcasts were still a decade away. Like telegraphs, wireless radio receivers of the time could only pick up Morse code dots and dashes. Those unable to attend a baseball game at Shibe Park due to work or family obligations had to be content with the detailed newspaper accounts published in the evening papers. Belmont at the time was a solidly middle-class neighborhood, largely a mixture of German, Italian, and Eastern European Jewish families. Although residents of Belmont enjoyed more leisure time than the factory workers of neighborhoods like Kensington, They still toiled long hours in the shops, groceries, law offices, and other small enterprises that lie on Lancaster Avenue. At 1:06 p.m. at that day, the streets were relatively empty, aside from a lone pedestrian and a couple of electric trolleys whooshing by. According to architect Robert Morris Scaler, whose family owned L. Scaler & Sons Kosher Butcher Shop, the owners usually lived above the store and all children were expected to help out with the chores. After hours, the adults would retire to the local pubs such as Trench's Saloon to scan the evening bulletin and discuss the merits of various players, the rising star Babe Ruth among them. After leaving classes at E. Spencer Miller School, the kids would have the same debates while hanging out at the Fury's ice cream parlor. Or they would reenact the game in games of half-ball on Belmont's side streets, which at the time were almost car-free. On warmer spring nights, the sounds of upright pianos and Camden-made phonographs, popularly known as Victrolas, emanated from rowhouse windows. Those who could spare a few dollars for a vaudeville show flocked to the William Penn Theater at 4063 Lancaster Avenue, completed 2 years earlier and able to seat 3,200 people at a time. The clock that stood outside 4255 Lancaster Avenue, located outside of the Walter M. Engel Jewelry Store, proudly noted that it kept railroad time. Inside the ornate little Engel store, another wall clock reminded the customers that it kept true time. Until the fall of 1883, almost all cities and towns in the United States kept their own local time, based on when the sun reached its highest point in the sky. Yet railroads such as the Pennsylvania, Union Pacific, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy had greatly reduced the time it took to transport freight and passengers across the country. Moreover, railroad managers needed uniform time schedules to keep hundreds of trains on schedule and from crashing into each other. Finding local time too burdensome, and it was, the railroads divided the country into 4 time zones, very close to the ones we know today. Despite a fair amount of local grumbling, most Americans adapted their lives around this executive fiat. In 1914, a clock marked railroad time in front of a store on Lancaster Avenue signified modernity and predictability, essential traits in industrial powerhouse cities such as Philadelphia. So did the dangling electric street light and the telephone wires overhead. On Sundays, the bells of Belmont's many churches chimed in sync with the subtle thunk of the Engel clock's minute hand. The city of Philadelphia on April 22, 1914, had its share of poverty and labor unrest, but by and large was prosperous and secure. Yet within a few months, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary would plunge the world into the bloodiest war in history. America joined the fight on the side of Britain, France, and Russia in April 1917. Scores of the young men of Belmont would leave their jobs, families, education, and their old time zone behind to fight in the trenches, patrol the seas, and soar in the skies. Industrial production ramped up, the pace of life quickened, and time became even more precious. At war's end, Congress made the 5 zones of railroad time synonymous with national time. This is historian Stephen Ujifusa, and this was the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast.